Hi, everyone. I'm Ivo Daalder, president of the Chicago Council on Global Affairs, and this is World Review, our weekly roundup of news from around the world. And joining us this week is Carol Giacomo, former correspondent of Reuters and a former member of the New York Times editorial board. Carol, wonderful to have you back.
Thanks, Ivo.
Also joining us is James Harding, who is co-founder and editor of Tortoise Media. James, wonderful to have you this week. And Gideon Rachman joining us is the chief foreign affairs columnist for the Financial Times. Gideon, welcome back. Well, we have a great amount of news. A lot of it was just delivered yesterday when Joe Biden, in his first major foreign policy speech, traveled all the way from the White House to Foggy Bottom in the State Department to deliver a statement on foreign policy. Carol, when you were watching and listening to it, what struck you about the speech? What is it that we should know about it?
So country-specific initiatives that Biden announced, notably ending America's offensive military involvement in the Saudi war in Yemen, garnered a lot of the headlines. To spend a minute reflecting on what he said about the State Department and the diplomats who serve there, and thus will be charged with implementing his vision of American re-engagement, a significant break with the Trump era. In so many ways, Trump demonstrated that he really only valued the military. He famously declared early on that he was the only diplomat that America needed, and he actually disparaged career diplomats as part of some nefarious deep state. Biden, however, made it clear, both in his inaugural address and more fully on Thursday, that he would elevate diplomacy as a tool for promoting America's interests. So the audiences for Biden's speech were both foreign and domestic, starting with the people who work for the State Department and who were actually the main audience for his speech. He praised on the diplomatic corps, including for their personal courage. He vowed that America is back, diplomacy is back, and you are at the center of all that I intend to do. You are the heart of it. Perhaps most importantly, he promised the diplomats that they would be trusted and empowered to do their job, and that he would have their back. Biden still has much to prove. Many experienced people have been named to top positions at the State Department, but a lot of the career diplomats who stuck it out during the Trump years really are looking for more of their ranks to be promoted. Nevertheless, Biden's undoubtedly were well received by what has been a demoralized cadre of public servants. Now, he also went on and talked about a number of issues. He said American leadership must meet this new moment of advancing authoritarianism, including the growing ambitions of China to rival the United States and the determination of Russia to damage and disrupt our democracy. He also emphasized there's no longer a bright line between foreign and domestic policy, and he rededicated the United States to old values, defending freedom, championing opportunity, upholding universal rights, respecting the rule of law, things like that. One of his foci was Russia, and he had some very strong comments about Putin, but we're going to talk about Russia separately. He also put a heavy emphasis on China, which he rightly called America's most serious competitor, and said we'll confront China's economic abuses, counter its aggressive course of action to push back on China's attack on human rights, intellectual property, and global governance. And while, even though he said China was so important, he really didn't expatiate on that. The administration is still pretty much developing its position in China, and I'm sure we're going to hear more about that in the future. So one of the more significant specific policy decisions that he announced and put himself behind was ending the war in Yemen, which he called a humanitarian and strategic catastrophe. Now, he appointed a new envoy to work on that on America's behalf. He stressed the importance of negotiated settlement, achieving a ceasefire, and perhaps most importantly, he said that America's support for offensive operations in Yemen would end. America has been a very important force multiplier for Saudi Arabia because of sales, because of, the Americans have done the repair work on the planes. They've provided targeting information and intelligence, and really there have been an important partner in what has become a huge disaster. So although Biden specifically mentioned ending the arms sales, and we knew he was moving in that direction anyway, my former New York Times colleagues have reported that they believe that this order has gone further and that the Americans will no longer be providing Saudis with targeting data and logistical support. That doesn't mean that United States support for Saudis' defensive needs will end. Biden specifically said that will continue.
Great overview, Carol. Thanks. Thanks so much, James. When you listen to Carol, when you read the speech or watch this, what struck you about it as the most important? And you're still on mute. You're still on mute, Jim.
Apologies. Thanks, Ivo. So Carol's description of it is absolutely perfect. It's filleted it. I have to say, I went a few weather systems in reading the speech. I didn't hear it, I read it. The first one is relief, right? It's okay, here is a serious commitment to America's place in the world, rooted in principle and in an idea of how America can use its force for good. By the end of it, I have to confess that relief sort of been overtaken by reality. And I know they're only a fortnight in this administration, but it did feel as though things had started to get real. You know, Navalny, what's the United States actually going to do? Aung San Suu Kyi, even more so, what's the United States actually going to do? And perhaps most critically, China. It's really unclear to me what the US position is on China, and increasingly it's the case that it's very hard to see how you pursue some of these other issues unless you're clear on that front. I do think the one thing that did stand out, and Carol said this at the top, that there was a really big decision, and it was a decision around Saudi and Yemen, not just in terms of, you know, the horrific experience of the people of Yemen, but actually a signal to Saudi and Gulf that there's a changing of the guard and that the rules have changed. That I think is really significant. I personally thought it was cleverly done because it said, look, we're moving away from Yemen, but we're not necessarily moving entirely away from Saudi. There was quite a lot of constructive talk on that front. So I thought that was definitely done.
Your overall reaction?
Yeah, I mean, similar to James, actually, in the sense that I thought reading the speech, a relief that America that stands up for democracy and human rights is back. I mean, that's incredibly important to those of us who value living in democracies, that the most powerful democracy believes in that, stands up for it around the world. But equally, what comes back with that are all the contradictions and difficulties that come with trying to uphold those values while living in a real world of power politics. I mean, Trump's foreign policy had a certain brutal simplicity to it. You know, America first, we don't really care about this human rights stuff, and I'm not going to make a fuss about it. When you go back to saying, actually, we do care about this, we care about what happens to Navalny or to democracy in Myanmar, you immediately run into this question that James mentions, yeah, and so what, you know? And if you care about place A, why don't you care as much about place B? And there aren't always straightforward answers to those questions. So you're back in a world of compromise and ambiguity, but I think better than where we were before.
Can I just jump in here? Look, this is the real world. There is no administration in any government anywhere, democratic or authoritarian, where everything, well, I mean, authoritarianism, I think, is easier overall because you just, the guy at the top makes the decisions. But in democracies, you're always going to find yourself in positions where you have to make choices of national interest, choices of allied interest, and choices of just pure principle. So all of that is true, Gideon, but that's where we are. And I am more grateful that Biden is now in that position than the previous guy.
And
James,
Ivo, just one thought, which actually I'm interested to know what you think, because you've actually got the sense of it from the inside. There was such a discussion in the run-up to the election and, of course, the inauguration about the return of alliance building, right? And that this would be an element of it. Actually, if you look at the speech, there wasn't much talk about the alliance building. The thing that was really interesting to me was alliance building within the architecture of the United States administration itself. Right, the sense that, to pick up on Carol's point, it was OD versus state. There was the most interesting thing to me that came out of it, if I was a reporter in DC now, would be looking into this force posture review. What do Austin and Blinken, when they put their heads together and say, all right, we've got the 2020s ahead of us, where do we want the US forces to be? That's the thing I'm really interested to see.
Yeah, I think you put your finger. In fact, you all put your finger on sort of the main. Although there was two or three interesting pieces, and the Saudi piece in particular was an important one. This had aspiration and process more than policy and decision. And in some ways, aspiration is important because the contrast with the previous administration was important to underscore. And I think you put your point on it, James, when you come to alliances, the aspiration was we need to repair our alliances and work with them and do things. And he made the important announcement, not surprising, the troops would not be withdrawn from Germany as planned. By the way, Congress had already moved on that in any case. But he didn't really talk about how do you use alliances to deal with these problems and how do you mobilize them in a more effective way than you have in the past. And I think that's that will come. And then this question of the posture review, which is either where are our forces, but also what's the relative balance between diplomacy on the one hand and military force on the other hand. And I think, as Carol said, this fundamental shift from a military dominant foreign policy to now a diplomacy dominant foreign policy is important tonally. The question is, what does it mean in practice? Carol, jump in there.
Yeah, it is early days, and I mean, he mentioned alliances in this speech and the need to that we could be stronger. We will be stronger in anything we do if we have our partners with us. And don't forget, Biden and Tony Blinken, the Secretary of State, have both been making lots of phone calls in the last 2 weeks to begin to get back developing those relationships with America's strongest partners and also some of its competitors like Putin.
Gideon seems to have lost for a minute, but yeah, go ahead, James. And I want you to also talk about the Saudi piece and your thought on that.
Yeah, I just tell you what I would do though is it's worth just picking a few holes in it, right? Because I think it's important. There's such a tendency, and it's inevitable, right? You compare it with what just came before,
right?
And and that's probably not rigorous enough on Biden, and we should be. There is a real opportunity in the world for global leadership around COVID, right?
Mm-hmm.
And that's where, if there is going to be an architecture, if there is going to be a system for bringing the world together, American leadership is really needed now, right? It wasn't there.
Yeah.
Right? It was, we're paying our dues to the WHO and we hope they can help. That is way short of what the world needs. And it's also a massive opportunity missed, in my view, in terms of US leadership today. Right? I don't. Sorry, Ivo. Did you want to respond to that?
No. I think well put.
Okay. I think that what's interesting was that he did square the circle on Russia. You did begin to think, we can talk to Russia on nuclear, but we are not going to have Russia, playing in our domestic politics. Right? You got to see how that could square. I do go back to the China point. It's really unclear what the position is, what a competitor means, and the difference between Biden, Obama, or sorry, that team when they came in, right, more than a decade ago, and the China of today is really significant. And that's the question mark in all of this. I thought on Saudi, it was really, it was significant that there was actually a material decision that was made. And it was made without a great deal of sort of awkward preamble in the diplomacy with Riyadh itself. It was a decision. And I think that's significant, and it's really significant in the region.
Gideon, on the Saudi piece, how do you think this was read in Riyadh? Did they see it coming on the one hand? And secondly, if the support for the Saudis in offensive operations was started by the Obama-Biden administration, supported by Vice President Biden and then Deputy Secretary of State Antony Blinken. And now there is the shift afterwards. How do you read that?
Well, I mean, I'd be interested to know how you read it since you were in that administration. But from the outside, it seems to me, has been growing disquiet at the course of that war, that the consequences have become harder and harder to ignore. The threat of famine in Yemen is real, particularly after the Trump administration's efforts to designate the Houthis as a terrorist group. And I think that they just felt that they couldn't ignore the humanitarian consequences of what was going on. People in the aid world say that what happened, Yemen could be the biggest famine since Ethiopia in the 80s. You can't really have that on conscience. You've got to draw a very clear line quickly. Of course, the Saudis will be very disconcerted, I think, particularly because they're already extremely uneasy about what the new administration may do over Iran. And obviously they see the issues as linked. So there is a reassurance job there. I mean, I think there is a limit to how far any American administration will swing away from Libya. I mean, it remains a crucial power in the region, but it may become a more problematic relationship in the way that maybe the US-Turkey relationship is difficult. Turkey's a member of NATO, it's an ally, then nobody wants to throw it overboard, but Erdogan is a problem. And I think that a Saudi Arabia led by MBS is going to be similarly problematic for America, but they're never going to make a break with it.
Let me shift gears, James, for a minute and go to Myanmar as an issue that frankly, few people were thinking was going to be one of the first foreign policy crises facing the Biden administration. Again, as under the previous Obama-Biden administration, that the opening inside Myanmar started democracy, at least the first root of democracy were sprouting. And now this military coup that was called a military coup d'etat by the State Department really poses a problem for an administration coming to power saying democracy and human rights are really the leitmotif of American engagement.
Yeah, I mean, you're so right, because I'm sure like a lot of us, you woke up on Monday morning, you said, what? There's a coup d'etat in Myanmar. Partly it tells you something about the problem with the consumption of news and information in our age, which is, the November elections happen. Essentially, the military starts playing the same tune that was being played in the United States, right? An attack on Aung San Suu Kyi's party, the NLD, the election was not fair, a whole assault on its legitimacy. And to be honest with you, I mean, I certainly wasn't paying much attention to it, and I think very few people were, but that was the case it made. And you do ask yourself in the back of your mind, how much do these tropes that you see that sometimes that came out of the United States play in other parts of the world. Putting that aside, if you're the new Secretary of State, this is a really real world problem, rather than, as you say, a point about aspiration and this, because the initial reaction of the media has been, well, what should our position be on Aung San Suu Kyi? You know, Nobel Peace Prize winner, but aided to the murder of Rohingya Muslims and the mass refugee crisis. I actually think that's not the really critical lens in diplomatic terms. The really critical lens is the United States saying all the right things in terms of process and principle. You know, the military has to reverse its position. It has to free Aung San Suu Kyi from these ridiculous detention charges. The United States stands up on principle, but the real money and the future of Myanmar is so closely tied to China and the China-Myanmar economic corridor. And so this is one of those moments where you have exactly what Gideon described, is that difficulty of a trade-off between rights and realpolitik. What kind of administration is this going to be? How do you be a United States that's going to stand up for its own trading interests, stand up and speak out about, you know, Uyghur detentions and, the crimes being committed against people in the west of China, and then at the same time hope that you can get around the table with Beijing and say, we have to stop what's happening in Myanmar. And the thing that's really problematic about this is, you know, as you said, you know, the United States was really critical in Aung San Suu Kyi's emergence from that long period of house arrest. I remember going to visit her in Yangon, and you were just struck by the willingness of people in Myanmar just to live with this oppression for years. For a long time, the world's response to it was sanctions. And in many ways, Myanmar's exhibit A in the weakness of sanctions as a diplomatic tool. It really impoverished large numbers of Burmese people, and it didn't really, you know, land a punch on the military generals. And so I'd be very interested to know what, you know, Kurt Campbell is thinking now, what the administration is thinking now, the levers at its disposal in response to the generals, because what we've seen in Myanmar before is an extraordinary willingness to live with this for a long period of time, even at the expense of the impoverishment of the Burmese people.
Carol, jump in here. James makes a lot of really good and important observations about the difficulty when you are confronted with a reality that is so directly opposed to your rhetoric.
Right.
And how you balance that with the realpolitik instincts. What do you think they should be doing?
Well, a couple of things. One, I think even though the Biden administration and Biden himself has made a strong point about the need to stand up for democracy and human rights, I get the sense that people are more have more humility about both the rhetoric in that regard and overpromising and overpromising because, you know, whatever the United States was after the end of the Cold War, when it was for a brief moment seemed to be the only superpower, the world is much more multidimensional now, and the United States certainly can't dictate what's going to happen. And I think there's a sense of that. That doesn't mean you still can't stand up for values and try to affect change in some way. And I think one of the conditions exists now that didn't exist before with Myanmar is that, you know, the economy, the country has opened up in the last few years since Aung San Suu Kyi came to office. And so you have investment by Singapore, you have investment by South Korea, you have investment by Japan, these countries with whom the United States has pretty good relationships. And certainly the South Korea and Japan are democracies, and one might hope that there's a strategy that you can put together. I mean, just diplomatically, they put pressure on the generals to perhaps back off and let a democratic government come back into play. I mean, I'm not saying it's a silver bullet, but that's what diplomacy is about, is trying to find, you know, pressure points where you can make an argument. And I still think the condition exists that Myanmar doesn't want to be a wholly owned subsidiary of China, even though they do have a strong relationship, and the Chinese have offered a lot of investment, have already made investment. The kind of investment they've made has not always benefited, and in many ways has not benefited, the rank and file people of the country, even though it's gotten rich. So I'm not saying it's easy, but I think there are things to work with there.
Gideon, Carol makes a good point that it's different to emerge from 30 years of dictatorship and build up democracy than when you've had 10 years of openness and then try to shut it down. I read in your paper today, a nation of 54 million people, there are 21 million Facebook accounts, and this is how they communicate and talk to each other, which is why the generals are shutting down Facebook, or at least trying to do so. Because there seems to be, in contrast perhaps to when James was there last, a population that is saying, well, wait a minute, we like what we had here. And after all, 80% voted for the NLD. And so does that give you an opening to say, can we put people and countries together in a coalition to start putting some pressure on? Or do you go back to realpolitik and accept that China is there and you have other interests? And you're muted, Gideon, just FYI. Love to hear what
my sense is that countries in that region, the more authoritarian they are, the closer they are to China generally. So that Cambodia is China's closest mate, and it's the most dictatorial country in ASEAN. That Thailand, when it had a military coup, moved closer to China. And there's a reason for that, which is that the generals in charge know that they're not going to get any heat from China on what they're doing internally. And I think probably the same rule will apply in Myanmar. The generals there are nationalists, and Burmese nationalists are very wary of China, the arms of the Chinese. But on the other hand, if the alternative is having to respond to pressure on human rights, I think China will look better to them. Although China does have ambitions that make a lot of Burmese anxious. I mean, there was a Burmese friend of mine said that the Chinese want to put a Yunnan province down to the sea, and were planning to build railway stations all along the route, and were asked that there be a Chinese station master in charge of each of those stations. That was their opening offer. And you know, any
Gideon, your sound is problematical right now.
To that.
So
On the other hand, if the Western option, from a point of view of Burmese, cutting. Sorry. Okay.
No, we'll get back to you in a second on this. Let's move on to. I mean, all important points. I love the Chinese station masters as it's going to be my new example of how the Chinese
Quite
are
memorable,
using
isn't it? I think. Yeah,
it's a wonderful example of that. Carol, let me. The other big sort of story in the speech, and the big story of the week, is of course Russia. With happening inside Russia, and this balancing act that James talked about earlier of, on the one hand, engaging with Russia on the issue of nuclear weapons, and on the other side, a whole series of issues where there are big differences between the United States and Russia. Biden administration that is willing to talk about it.
Right. Okay, so as Biden made clear in the speech, he intends to cooperate with Putin when practical and deter him when necessary. That likely means the US-Russia relationship will be deeply adversarial for the foreseeable future, not least because, according to US intelligence, Putin had a clearance for Trump's reelection. I want to point out at the beginning, though, that it is not unusual for the United States to have adversarial relationships with big countries and yet also find ways to cooperate with them. I mean, it's not easy, but that's part of diplomatic skills. You have to find areas of convergence, see where you can make progress, and then acknowledge that there will be conflict in other areas. So on the cooperation side, the United States and Russia this week agreed to extend the New START treaty for 5 years, and that's an important accomplishment. It's the only remaining treaty between the two countries, which together have the overwhelming majority of nuclear weapons, and it's essential to safeguard nuclear stability. The pact requires both countries to deploy no more than 1550 nuclear warheads, to submit to intrusive inspections, and to exchange certain specific data. For 4 years, Trump resisted a quick extension of the treaty, which doesn't require Senate approval, because he was obsessed with China, and he argued that China had to be brought into the treaty first. That may sound good in practice, but China has a fraction of the weapons Russia and the United States do, and refused to join in negotiations, at least for now. Biden knew that retaining New START was central to both preventing a new arms race and to shoring up the broader complement of arms control agreements intended to halt proliferation. But in his speech, Biden publicly and personally repeated the message he gave to Putin in a recent phone call. And what he said was that the days of the United States rolling over in the face of Russia's aggressive actions, interfering with our elections, cyber attacks, poisoning its citizens are over. Those are pretty strong words. Unlike Trump, Biden promised we will not hesitate to raise the cost on Russia and defend our vital interests in our people. And he also predicted that we'll be more effective in dealing with Russia when we work in coalition and coordination with other like-minded partners. As mentioned, one matter Biden raised directly with Putin involved Alexei Navalny, Putin's most fierce political opponent. A Russian leader tried to poison Navalny, who was taken to Germany for treatment, survived, and returned to Russia to continue the fight, and was promptly arrested. This week, he was sentenced by Russia's notoriously corrupt court system to almost 3 years in jail. In a court statement, Navalny asserted that he was being returned to jail because, quote, he morally offended Putin by surviving an attempt at my life, he ordered. Navalny no doubt stoked further anger by releasing a YouTube video showing that Putin has an opulent palace, is building an opulent palace on the Black Sea. Rather than be cowed by the attempted assassination and Navalny's jailing, Russians have poured into the streets of more than 100 Russian cities to support Navalny and protest against Putin. Predictably, Putin cracked down with force, and there have been more than 3,000 arrests. Few expect Putin to be overthrown, at least in the short term, but Navalny, who took a calculated risk coming back to Russia and is unquestionably the opposition leader, may be preparing the ground for eventual political change. He certainly is winning the PR war, demonstrating courage and principle in the face of Putin's bullying and fear of competition. And in a new sign that Putin sees Navalny as a threat, the state brought new charges against him today, accusing him of slandering a war veteran. But the opposition is growing. It now has something like 40 offices across Russia, and most of its millions of followers are young people who have not challenged the Kremlin before. And Biden, again, picking on this issue of being critical of Russia and standing up for human rights and political pluralism, made a point about this case in his speech. He said, and I quote, "The politically motivated jailing of Alexei Navalny and the Russian efforts to suppress freedom of expression and peaceful assembly are a matter of deep concern to us and the international community." He said that Navalny's been targeted for exposing corruption. He should be released immediately and without condition. Now, deep concern may seem like pretty anemic language, but consider that Trump not only didn't criticize Putin during his tenure, he actively preferred him to Democratic leaders. We don't know what steps Biden might do to sort of implement his words, but I would just mention an incident that occurred in 2014 after Mikhail Khodorkovsky, the Russian oligarch, got out of prison after 10 years. Putin had put him in prison, and we had written a lot of editorials on Khodorkovsky's behalf at the New York Times, and he came to see me when he was released. And the big takeaway I had from that conversation was that he said he thought that Putin's biggest Achilles heel would be if people got to see details of the corruption, of the wealth that Putin and his allies have amassed. And now that we see the effect of this video that Navalny helped to promote, it seems like a really good tactic.
Carol, let me jump in here. And James, you earlier said about the speech that there was relief at the end, mixed with reality. Do you have the same sense that that's true when it comes to Biden's policy towards Russia?
So this is one of those issues. A group of friends and I, Ivo, at the end of each year, we give our predictions for the next year, and we each have to give 3. Most years I'm 0 for 3. Let's be honest. All of the predictions are interesting and untrue. The ones that this year that I'm most uncertain about is Russia. The sort of iron rule that Putin survives no matter what is the one thing I'm actually least certain about this year. The overwhelming odds are yes, but you look at the polls for the United Russian Party, something is really shifting. If you look at the 20-year decline in real living standards, particularly concentrated in cities, that begins to take its toll. And there are parliamentary elections to the Duma, I think, have to be held by September, right? There's a forcing mechanism here that is going to put some pressure on the political system. And, Navalny made a very, very courageous but clear choice in returning. I think Carol's point about Khodorkovsky is important. Russia likewise can wear its dissidents in prison for a long period of time. But this is the first time for a long time that I've been uncertain about Putin's future. But Gideon and you, frankly, would have a much better feel on it for me. It just feels more precarious than it's been before.
Yeah.
Well, there's a certain nervousness you see in the regime's behavior, Gideon, that wasn't there before. The fact that they locked Navalny up and that Putin felt it necessary to personally deny the Palace YouTube video and mention Navalny by name for the first time.
Yeah.
Sort of senses of nervousness, and yet, of course, the state apparatus is pretty loyal to the king.
Yeah, absolutely. And I apologize sincerely for my broadband. I'll try and be brief, so before I get cut off by the band gods again. But look, no, I think that's right. And talking to friends in Moscow, they said that the police are behaving with much more brutality than they have with previous demonstrations in Moscow. That they were pulling people out of taxis, beating them up. This was somebody who just shouted a stray remark. They were using the billy club in a way that they've been doing in Belarus. Unfortunately, that parallel is not totally reassuring because Lukashenko is still in power in Belarus, and the administration may feel at the same time insecure, but also confident that if they lock up Navalny for, he's not going to go away for 3.5 years. As Carol was saying, they'll charge him with other things. They may charge him with treason. They'll put him away for as long as they feel necessary. They'll chuck people out of their jobs. They'll beat them up on the streets. And it may work, I'm afraid. One would like to believe that it won't, but it may. I mean, I was talking, however, to a Russian friend, rather beautifully Russian comment. He said to me, Putin is finished. And I said, oh, really? You think he's going? He said, oh, I don't know when he'll go. He said, he'll go in 5 years, 10 years, could be 20. But what is 20 years to history? And then he said, although it is quite a lot to Navalny's family. So there's this sort of sense that the point he was making is that Putin's legitimacy is shot. It was very strong after Crimea. I think after the revelations about the palace, apparently the Russian YouTube is full of not just people watching that video, but memes and jokes and etc. And Putin's response was deeply unconvincing. They waited 5 days, and then he said, "Oh, it belongs to my best friend, not to me." That's not great.
Right.
So, but it does. So it does raise the question. Then, unlike in 2014, 15, or 16, when Putin's popularity was significant post Crimea, and the economic decline hadn't felt itself in the pocketbooks, at least in people in Moscow and St. Petersburg that James talked about. Now all of that is happening, and it does suggest: is there an opening for wise policy on the part of a Biden administration to try to push this, or in fact is a bigger American hand just what Putin wants in order to have nationalist fervor ignited?
Just a quick word, because I'd be interested to know what you and Carol think about it. But as you know, Victoria Nuland is a hate figure in Moscow. I was really struck just after Crimea. I went there, and they were talking about Satan. I had this wonderful thing of being able to say, well, they were talking about how awful she was, and I said, oh yeah, I just saw her last week, and people leapt back in their seats, But her reappointment to the State Department will be seen as a deeply aggressive act in Moscow, and will make them quite nervous. And equally, she is a confrontational person, and if she's in charge of the Russia policy, I wouldn't look for much by way of rapprochement. She won't be in charge, but she'll be an influential voice.
She's the number 3 person will be, if confirmed, the number 3 person in the State Department, and could very well be the voice of the administration on this issue. Carol?
I'd be surprised if she's not the voice on Russia, and she'll be a tough competitor for Putin for sure.
James, answer your own question. You think the voices of Putin that are there that you described. What is it that not only the Biden administration, but frankly the Johnson administration, the European Union, countries around the world could do to bring this process along of change inside Russia?
I think not much that they could do, and I think there's even less that they will do. So I think the reality of this is that, yes, you take a strong posture on it, but you don't really have any levers within Russia that are that significant. The question is whether or not things, corrode from within. But it's also the painful thing for the Navalny family, the supporters of Navalny, is you have to make a calculation whether or not this is going to be your priority issue, and I suspect it's not. And so as a result, what you're going to do is you're going to try and contain Putin internationally, but you're not going to be able to move it in much internally, because if you look at your hierarchy of issues, whether it's climate, whether it's China, reorientation in the Gulf, rebuilding alliances, I don't think you have the natural bandwidth to deal with Russia.
Although, one of the interesting things about Joe Biden is Russia is a preoccupation for him personally, in the sense that, when he was asked what is the biggest threat to the United States, his answer is Russia. China is the biggest competitor, which means there is a cooperative relationship. He said that again in his speech. and he cares deeply about it, but also puts the question on high on the agenda. What are you going to do about it? Because it's one thing to talk about it; it's another thing to figure out what to do about it. But the good news is we will be back for another World Review next week and weeks after. The issues of Russia and democracy and how the Biden administration works together with allies won't go away. Unfortunately, we do have to go away at this time. Carol Giacomo, James Hart, Gideon Rachman, thanks so much for joining us once again for World Review this week. And we hope to see you back shortly to talk about what's happening in the world, why should we care, and what we should do about it. Thanks so much for joining.
Bye. Thanks.
Thank you.